It's so wonderful to be able to share these important learnings with you. I'm so grateful that Pam is also helping with this as well. Just want to do we did an enormous amount last time, the thousands of years, um, and tried to understand the big picture. And I do want to just at the beginning enable anyone to ask any questions that they might have, any confusions or clarifications they went away to look up and they wanted to contribute. So let's just start with some open questions or comments about last week's work and anything you wanted to comment on about that before we move into the next stage. Just to remind you, we covered everything from Neolithic man and woman all the way through the biblical period, through then the Roman period, and we talked about the Christian period before the Crusades, and then the Crusades themselves. We went into the Muslim period, and we went right up into the in time of the Ottoman Empire. And I did keep stressing the fact that because the northern and southern borders of these holy lands are open, that it makes it very easy for people to traverse the land going north or south. And there is no natural boundary to that happening, which is why outside elements are always coming from the north or coming from the south, whereas the natural elements of the hills and the mountains to the east and the sea to the west keep it pretty enclosed. And that means that the people who are living in the areas are pretty much living on top of each other. And as we reminded everyone, the distance between the sea and the River Jordan is probably about 40 miles, which is only between here and Natick, somewhere like that, not very far. So that was the general sense of what we were talking about. Anyone got any questions, confusions to be clarified, comments to be made? Anything that relates to anything before 1880? It's good that people are coming in while I'm talking so that I won't start anything new until everyone's here. We have a lovely group. Okay, so tonight, Pam and I.
Rabbi?
Yes, sorry, someone. Oh, yes,
Leslie. I don't have a question about last week, but I do have a question about this week, which I'm
get it in early, right?
Pardon me?
Get it in early, yeah.
Right. Which I'm sure you'll go into. I was just looking for the advertisement for this week. The quote about the land doesn't belong to us, but we belong to the land. I've heard that for many, many years, and I was trying to get it settled into my head as to a good meaning for it, what it actually means. So I have a feeling you'll go into that.
Okay.
But if you don't.
Remind me, yeah. Thank you. We left off with the basic fact that the land has always been occupied, always, by groups of people. When we got to this period of the 19th century, the land was being occupied by Jews and Christians, Bedouin and Arabs, and all of those groups, and actually Europeans as well, who had institutions in Jerusalem. For instance, the Eastern Church had institutions of their own in Jerusalem, and there was a French consulate and French charitable organizations, that kind of thing. So the land has always been occupied. Let's take away any myth that this was an empty land. It was never empty. Both the the coastal plain, which we talked about was the agricultural side of the land, and the hill country, where most of the cities and the towns are. So the cities and the towns were always occupied. The coastal plain did suffer from a lack of population around the 19th century, when there was difficulties in farming in that part of the world. But there were very numerous small Arab villages that were occupied by tribal families, and then had the land around those villages, and that land became part of their domain. Most of that land was being used for the production of olive oil, of course, from olive oil trees, from olive trees, and also some wine. And then there was some trade in other products, particularly like pottery, handmade pottery, what we might call handcrafts today, or folk craft today. We know, for instance, there was a very strong and well-known Armenian community in Jerusalem who were producing Armenian pottery, which you can still buy in Jerusalem, very kind of distinctive blue. And that minority population was brought into Jerusalem at a time, you'll remember near the end of last week, I said that the Muslim population grew in the land around the 1810s to the 1850s. This was a time of a decline of the Ottoman Empire, and that more and more Arab peoples were coming into this part of the land. And the Armenian community is a very good example of that. They were brought specifically to the land, and I'm avoiding the name for a minute. They were brought specifically to the land to actually decorate the roof of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And it's decorated with blue tiles from very expert Armenian tradespeople and artisans. And that community then came and lived in Jerusalem and then settled there. The tradespeople, the artisans and their families. So there was an influx into the land, and there's always been an influx into the land. But we do get a real shift around the 1880s, when the rise of the Zionist movement produced a real move for persecuted peoples, Jewish peoples from Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, to come to this part of the world. This was a massive immigration, originally called Aliyah Bet, which was the idea that a Jew would go up. Aliyah means to go up, would go up to the Holy Land, and there would settle and reside. This large immigration obviously had an influence on the local population, and as more and more Jews arrived and started taking up place, particularly originally in the four main cities, that is Hebron, Jerusalem, Safat, and Tiberias, but gradually more and more into other places like Akko, Haifa, Beersheba. That became the place where Jews would come. Most of them who were coming from Eastern Europe were tradespeople, small merchants, very little in the way of professions or education, and mostly coming from, as I say, the Russian Empire, due to the persecution that was happening at that time in Russia and the accompanied countries around it. As we move towards the First World War, we get a further increase in Aliyah, Jewish immigration into the land, but now coming from other countries, Western countries, and also a different type of immigrant, no longer just a manual worker, let's say, from the Russian Empire, but now we're getting professionals and we're getting tradespeople and we're getting people who are also interested in this emerging concept of socialism. And so the idea of cooperative farms was set up, and the very first cooperative farm in the late 1900s, in the late 1800s, sorry, set up in Tigania at the bottom of Lake Tiberias, Sea of Galilee. And that was the beginning of a new wave of immigration into the land. So things are radically shifting and changing, which results in a counter move by the Arab populations to begin to think about their own identity. Now, the one word that I haven't used up to now is the word Palestinian, because really up to this time period, the word Palestinian doesn't really exist. There is the country on the name Palestine or Palestina, which we've spoken about earlier, which the Romans used. And there is the word Palestine that is sometimes used in some records about this area by the Ottomans. But it's not until really the beginning of the First World War, 1914, that we even get to think about a people called Palestinian. And this becomes the beginning of what we call Arab nationalism. Arab nationalisms, and I'm sure many of you are beginning to be familiar with this history, the people in the regions, that is the regions that today we would call Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, were seeking more independence under the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to have a Muslim nation that crossed these boundaries. This was particularly centered around Syria. Syria was considered to be the leading nation of this pan-nationalism. There was an Arab Congress in 1913 that was beginning to think about the Arab peoples as a people and their national identities and their desire for nationalism, their own countries with their own sovereignty, not unlike Zionism or indeed other nationalisms that were emerging at the same time, Indian nationalism on the Indian subcontinent and others. So we come to the First World War. Obviously, that has a major impact because the Ottoman Empire basically falls apart. The British and the French take over this region, and the British particularly are the ones who conquer, take over this area of land, and they call it Palestine. So I certainly have relatives in Israel who originally, when they came to this part of the land, they were given a Palestinian passport and they were told they were Palestinians. And that was the word that the British used to describe this territory. But alongside that British use of the name of the country, there also then became the idea that there was a people called Palestinian who were indigenous to this area who also lived there. The British didn't really have full understanding, or if they did, they were intently duplicitous about their plans, because as we know, the Balfour Declaration in 1925 declared that the British government was in favor of a Jewish homeland in this area. And that's, Leslie, where this phrase originally came from, the idea that a people for a land that has no people. That was where the phrase originally came from. And that was definitely either a strategic, intentional lie, or it was just naive to think that this land was unoccupied and therefore the British government could basically hand it over to a nascent Jewish nation. However, at the same time, the French and the British were carving up the Middle East in their own way. And again, won't go into all of the details, but the French basically decided, they would take over the areas east of the Jordan, that is Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon, and the British would take over Egypt and Israel. So it was a clear carve up of the empires to decide how these lands would be divided. That didn't work out too well, so eventually tribal factions in the region took over the areas that we now call Jordan and Syria and Iraq. And the Faisal family was very influential there. So the Faisal family took over Saudi Arabia, eventually took over Jordan and Syria and Lebanon as well. So that's where the Arab nationalism was fed by the fact that the British and the French empires could no longer hold on to this territory after the First World War. And there was a real sense that the Arab peoples who live there deserve and should have their own nationalities. The only peoples not to receive their own territory and their own sovereignty at that time were the Palestinian peoples. So this was obviously a huge issue, and lots of questions and lots of historical analysis of why the Palestinians didn't receive a land like the Jordanians received land and had their own sovereignty, or the Syrians did as well. What was it about this part of the land the Palestinians were denied their opportunity to have the land? And of course, some of it, a lot of it, was due to the fact that the Jewish immigration was increasing all the time. We'll just talk about the British mandate. So, as I said, the British are in this area now after the First World War. They have a mandate from the United Nations to look after it. They're supposed to support and guide local people to self-governance and independence. They did set up systems, the British civil service, well known for how to set up a system in a structure in a country, as they had done in India. So they set up systems for health and governance and laws and education. And in fact, today in Israel, quite a lot of the infrastructure of the country is still based upon the British Mandate Foundation. They were supposed to mediate and manage violence that was increasing between Arab and Jew, both of whom lived in the land. They were, as I said, the British had stated publicly they were in favor of a homeland for the Jews. And they had proposed that the land be divided between Jews and Arabs who were in the land. We get to the Second World War, and of course, the immigration now increases significantly again, of Jewish immigration coming from Nazi lands, and that tips the balance over so that the violence increases between Jew and Arab, and the British are having to hold the mandate and doing it very badly, often by restricting immigration into the country so that Jews from German lands, Germany, Austria, France, could not enter the land, were sent to either detention camps in Cyprus or were sent back to concentration camps in Germany. And I think we know that story. So the demographics, just to lay it out for you, as you see, the number of Jews in 1914 was about 100,000. The number of Arabs, Bedouin, and others in the land was about 500,000. And so the Jewish percentage was 13%. By the end of the First World War, coming into the 20s, the Jewish immigration is beginning, and however, the numbers for non-Jews is also rising as well. By the time you get to 1930, you begin to see a rise in the percentage of the Jewish population from 13 to 17%, and that continues to rise until you get to 1947, where you'll see there's now more than 500,000 Jews in the land. So we've doubled, the Jews have doubled, have sixfold increased their numbers. the non-Jews, the Arab population, has doubled their numbers, and that results in a 32% percentage of Jews. But by the time we get to 1948, after the Second World War, we get now 716,000 Jews, and then, of course, a huge decrease in the Arab population. And we'll talk about that in a second. That results in now a Jewish majority in the land, with a total population of 872,000, coming up towards 1 million. Today, there are about, I think, 8 million people in the land. So, and the percentage has continued to be around this number if you don't include the occupied territories. So the shift in percentage of Jewish immigration really made a difference and created a huge resentment. And of course, the British, who were in charge at the time, really had no idea how to navigate and manage this situation. So we went back to the United Nations. The United Nations approved a partition plan. You will remember that famously the United Nations wanted to divide the country into two, basically, as I've always indicated, between East and West. On the West side, in green, is the Jewish allocation. That is the coastal plain, the agricultural plain, which is great for the farmers and the kibbutzim that have now developed in that area. It includes the what we might call the backside of the Sea of Galilee, that is towards Syria, which is also a very fertile area. It's the Jordan Valley area, and in the south, in the Negev, which is empty of population, except for Bedouin who move around that area, and the Jewish commitment was to make the desert bloom. That was the phrase that was used. And when we were giving money to buy trees, a lot of that went into helping green the land in the various areas that Jews were going to inhabit. You'll see that the Gaza area, I don't need to point that out, I think, but you know where that is. The Gaza area and this area just on the Egyptian border was part of the Arab allocation, along with, of course, Samaria and Judea. That is the West Bank area. And up here in the Galilee, where there is a high percentage of Arab population. The partition was made by population, by where the population lived. This middle area, in a slightly different color, was considered international. It was going to be an international corridor where Jerusalem was going to be managed by some kind of United Nations body. So all that would have happened had it not been for the fact that the Arab nations decided to invade Israel on the birth of its independence in May, 5th of May, 1948. And a war ensued, as you know, and that led to a completely different look of the map. So the map then was no longer a partition, but rather resulted in a number of factors. So this is what it looked like after the war in 1949. So here you still have the Jewish areas that are in pink here, that include that small area on the border of Egypt, doesn't include the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip remains under Egyptian control. The borders go up to the Jordan River. It includes this area up into Lebanon, and the area that is in green was held by Jordan. Jordan had invaded Israel, taken over this area, and now Jordan was in control of this area, including Jerusalem. But as you'll see, the orange part and the green part just touch. So that's where Jerusalem meets. So on this map, on this inlay, you'll see that the old city of Jerusalem was in Jordanian territory, but the west side of Jerusalem was in Israeli territory. So you will remember there was the Mandelbaum Gate, where there was a gate and a wall. You could not, if you were Jewish, you could not go into the old city. You could not go to the Western Wall or to any of the holy places. And if you are Jordanian, although there was a bridge, actually, the Allenbury Bridge that was open, you couldn't, without visa, you could not go into Israel, into West Jerusalem. So they were completely separate. Jerusalem was basically split in half, although the old city was entirely in Jordanian territory. And you will remember there was shelling weekly, there was shooting regularly across the border here, and residents were kept apart. The Jordanians had no more right to that land than anybody else, and we have to remember that the Jordanians did not offer Palestinians their own sovereignty. So it was not as if the Jordanians then said, okay, we've taken over this territory, we'll turn it into a country called Palestine. They didn't do that. And Palestine and Palestinians still yearned for their own sovereignty. So, and they weren't very happy about Jordanian rule either. And of course, people in Gaza over here were under Egyptian rule, so they didn't have their own sovereignty either. So Israel now was forming itself by 1949. It was a country. It had started building its institutions, started building the land, and further immigration. And I think there's one very important thing to note about immigration into the land, because we get accused of being colonialists from Europe. But you'll see in a minute from the numbers that actually the beginnings of the State of Israel were made up primarily of Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, that is, Jews from Arab countries who were displaced by the Arab countries in which they had been living for, well, as we know, thousands of years. You know, Jews had been living in Iraq, in Babylonia, since the first Babylonian dispersion in 586 BCE. So this was the end of the Babylonian community in 1948. And it was a great tragedy, obviously, that the Jews of Baghdad, the Jews of Egypt, the Jews of Yemen, the Jews of Syria, Aleppo. The Aleppo is, we have the oldest biblical manuscript from Aleppo. All of those Jews were forcibly expelled from the Arab countries and sent into this small Israeli state. So when we think of Israel, we often think of it as maybe as a European or an American satellite. But really, the people who have occupied and have lived there since 1949 have been, in the majority, the Sephardi Mizrahi community. But also because of the catastrophe of 1948, in Arabic called the Nakba, and 750,000 Arabs were also displaced from the Holy Lands, and they either left of their own accord, or they were encouraged to leave, or they were forcibly deported. And historians over the last 70 years have written about this differently. The first group of historians very much talked about Arabs leaving of their own voluntary nature, with this famous adage that, you know, we'll leave now, and then when the Arab countries have been successful, we'll come back. That was certainly what I was taught when I was learning this material. But Israeli revisionist historians, and of course other historians, have changed that now to suggest that many of the dispersions of the Arabs were forcible, that whole communities were told to leave. Certainly areas of Haifa, that was the case. The famous cases in Lod, where the whole community of the town of Lod was forcibly evicted. And we know that there were also massacres where Jewish soldiers massacred the Arab population in places like Deir Yassin, which is a famous and notorious episode of this period. So, the population in Gaza remained the same for this period because nothing happened to it. But we had 850,000 Jews displaced from Arab and North African countries, including Morocco and Algeria, and 600,000 moved to Israel. It was difficult in the 1950s to be a Sephardi or a Mizrahi Jew because the country had been set up by the Ashkenazim, and they had set up the institutions. They had set up the ways in which people were going to be educated, to worship and to live. And that was not comfortable for many of the people coming from, say, North Africa and other countries. They were looked down upon. There was racial prejudice. And over the years, Israel has had to absorb and develop a culture that has been multicultural and multiracial. At the same time, as I hope you all know, that the Israeli state included in its constitution all those who are not Jewish. They all have a vote. They all have the right to citizenship, anyone living inside the land, and they all have the rights that every other citizen have to education, to healthcare, everything else. The only thing that Arabs are not allowed or not invited to do is be part of the military call-up, which is mandatory for Jews in Israel. There is a part of the Arab community that is invited to be part of the military, and that's the Druze community. The Druze community live in certain hilly areas around Mount Carmel near Haifa, and they are Muslims, but they have always been fiercely devoted to the state of Israel and have always fought on the side of Israel, and so they are invited to be part of the military. Where did the Jews come from? We talked about that. And of course, that continued in Iran in the 1970s as the Shah of Iran fell and Iran became an Islamic state. 180,000 Jews were expelled from Iran. So the common accusations against Israel currently are about colonialism and apartheid. It is neither colonial nor is it an apartheid state in that it doesn't make the discriminations that, for instance, were made in South Africa between Jew and non-Jew. Everyone has a right to vote. Everyone has a right to all the rights of citizenship. That is within the boundaries of Israel. I'm not including the occupied territories. And we talked a little bit about discrimination within Israel too, that occurred at that time. Yeah, we don't need to do that. By the time we get to 1967, as you know, there is another war initiated by Israel this time, although it was probably just before Egypt was about to attack anyway. That war resulted in all of the countries of the Middle East, including Iraq, which has no border with Israel, and Saudi Arabia, attacking Israel. They sent troops to Israel, but miracles, Israel survived, and the borders changed again. This time, Israel occupied Gaza and the Sinai and the West Bank, and therefore you reunified Jerusalem as one city. It also took the very important Golan Heights, which is a strategic mountainous area overlooking Syria. And this is crucial because whoever occupies that land can shoot down into the valley below. So if it's the Israelis, they're overlooking Syria. If it's the Syrians, they can overlook all the kibbutzim and all of basically the whole Galilee is in their sights all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And you can actually, if you've been to the Golan Heights, you can actually see the Mediterranean Sea from the mountain tops there. So as we've always said, it's not that far away. So it's a crucial area. So there was around 1968 a plan to return the West Bank and the Golan Heights to Jordan. But that plan didn't come to anything, and that resulted in really the last whole era of violence and conflict between the peoples. The land is now occupied, so the West Bank and that whole area is now occupied territory. It's under military rule. Gaza, as you know, originally was taken over by Israeli settlers and had Israeli settlers and Arab population living side by side. But the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided that he would remove all the Jewish inhabitants of Gaza in 2005. So in 2005, Israel left Gaza in order that Gaza could become its own autonomous region, left it in the hands of the Palestinian movement, which quickly was overturned by a new organization called Hamas. And Hamas took over the Gaza Strip and has been there ever since. And as we know, what happened then. Israel also returned the Sinai Desert to Egypt. And out of that came a peace treaty with Egypt and a peace treaty with Jordan. So we now have peace on the southern and eastern side of Israel. And as you probably heard last Saturday night, Jordan joined in, the Jordanian Air Force joined in with Israelis and the Americans and the British to shoot down the rockets that were coming from Iran. So that peace holds. Egypt, the peace with Egypt has held for so long. They do have a border with Gaza. As you know, there is a door, a gate from Egypt into Gaza, which means that Egypt can bring things into Gaza if they want to. They do not want to. They can also receive refugees from Gaza if they want to, which they don't. So Gaza, again, has been a problem both for Egypt and Israel, but Israel at the moment is there conducting a war. But up to or before October the 7th, it was both Egypt and Israel that were responsible for keeping the Palestinian population under siege in Gaza. We do have a population issue now in that the occupied territories are no longer considered part of Israel, and therefore there's a huge population in the millions of Palestinian peoples who are stateless. And although the most recent negotiations after the Oslo Agreement allowed for autonomous territories that would be ruled by the Palestinian Authority, what are called Area A, B, and C. So there is an Area A that is governed by the Palestinian Authority. There's an Area B that is shared territory between Palestinian and Israeli, and Area C, mostly around Jerusalem, where Israelis hold the area under military rule. So these arrangements have tried to bring in a sense of governance so that the Israelis don't have to control whole millions of people under occupation, but has not really worked, partly because it's Israeli military rule, which is very stringent, and partly because the Palestinian Authority is corrupt and has not been able to hold its own territory well and govern it well. When I meet with Palestinians in the West Bank, they tell me they hate the Palestinian government as much as they hate the Israeli government. So, the hate is shared. So that's kind of the situation we are at. I won't go into current developments. Obviously, you've all been watching the news and you know what happened October 7th and you know what happened on Saturday night. I think I'm going to pause there. I'm going to let people ask any questions they want, and then we're going to ask Pam to say a little bit about her experiences, and then we're going to open up to your experiences of current Israel and visiting there and your time in that area and what your hopes are for the future. Any questions or comments? Anything you want to add, clarify?
Why can you clarify why did Sharon in 2005 withdraw the Israelis from Gaza?
It was a move to remove Jewish presence from an area that would, under the Oslo agreement, had things worked out, it would have allowed the Palestinian Authority to have control over both the West Bank and Gaza, and that would have been the beginning of a state. It would have also had a corridor that led from Gaza to the West Bank. You'll see that the area between Gaza and the West Bank is not that distant, and there was going to be a corridor, probably a covered road. That was one idea that would allow Palestinians to move from the West Bank into Gaza and back again. But in order to do that, you want to create a secure boundary so that Jews stay in their Jewish territories and Arabs stay in the Arab territories, and that if you want to cross from one to the other, you have to go through, a border control. And in order to do that, Sharon, who, as we know, was a hawk on these matters, felt that it would make it easier to create this solution. And I do feel that Israeli politicians in the past, I'm not sure about the current ones, but in the past, they've always, even if they've been hawkish, they've tried to find ways to solve problems rather than make problems, even if the solving the problem was to the benefit of Israel. But in this case, I think Sharon was trying to solve a problem by ensuring that Israelis were inside areas he could govern. He didn't need to then have a military presence in Gaza, and the military completely removed themselves from Gaza, which of course now we see the problem with that. I think that's what I want to say about that. Hal.
I have two things. Well, one is the area Sharon thing, I was told, was a hope of land for peace.
Yeah.
They were hoping that they could give land to the Palestinians and it would create, a sense of peace. But the other two questions that I was really looking at is the role of the Grand Mufti in Jerusalem, and then the subsequent arming of native Israelis against both the British and the Palestinians via the Irgun.
That's a whole fascinating area. I love that time. I recommend, and in fact, maybe after tonight, we'll put a book list together of things to read. But there's a wonderful book by Benny. It's called 1948, 1948. I can't remember his last name. Benny, does anyone remember? He's one of the kind of Israeli historians, and he's written this massive book about 1948 and includes the fact that the great Mufti, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, al-Husseini, was really a Nazi sympathizer. Had he had his way, he met with Hitler many times. Had he had his way, he would have developed a Holocaust in this part of the world. Thankfully, he didn't and couldn't. But it's part of the Arab nationalism and the extreme Arab nationalism that came out of the 1940 Second World War, the 1948 era. So yes, that's a fascinating period, and there are lots of books and the movies. There are some movies about it as well, which are all very interesting. Thanks, Hal. I saw another hand up. Oh, Linda. Linda, you're muted.
Somehow I've been telling myself all this time that the British mandate really was the Israel area and Jordan, and that the British gave to Abdullah, the Hashemite son, part of Jordan after World War I, with the promise that maybe there would be more later, but they held the rest as what they called Palestine, right? And that then World War II, when the Jewish state was in the mind of the British, they then gave Abdullah the rest of the area that is now Jordan. No?
No, the British had nothing to do with, once they left in 1948, once they left in 1948, they had nothing to do with the Middle East, obviously, but the British had nothing to do with Jordan after Jordan was established as a separate kingdom with King Hussein, King Abdullah, and then King Hussein. So the British had not been part of the Jordan. Jordan had been a country for a long time. And in fact, Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, went to meet with King Hussein secretly, which we didn't know about until the 1970s, and tried to get an agreement with Jordan. And Jordan always held back from initiating trouble with Israel. But once in 1948, once Syria and Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded, Jordan felt it had no choice. And it also invaded. It had the best army in the region. Jordan had an army trained by the British. All the officers had been to Sandhurst. They were British army officers who were, in fact, some were actually British army officers who were leading Jordanian troops in 1948. And they took over, as we saw, they took over the entire West Bank quite quickly. None of the other armies ever conquered any land. They were all pushed back by what was the nascent Israeli army that really didn't really have very much experience either. But
did they make the people on the West Bank Jordanian citizens at that time?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Right, and Lucy.
I've been wondering why in May 1948 the Arab countries attacked and lost, and Israel won. And on your screen it said because they had American support. So of course I'm wondering why they had American support. That's one question.
So Truman had been lobbied by the Jewish community in I'm just trying to remember if that's correct. Is that Truman, 1948? Am I right? Yes, I'm right, Truman. So Truman had been heavily lobbied by the Jewish lobby in America to support the new Jewish state, because they said it would be an ally of the United States, and it would provide, for the first time ever, for the Western powers to have permanent bases and opportunities for overseeing the newfound oil that was going to be, developed and expanded through Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates after that. So it was a huge prize to make sure that Israel came into being as a Western ally, in order that then, from then on, the United States had a toehold in the Middle East. And also it was, this is all global politics, but there was also trying to stop communism as well, stop Russia from coming into the area as well. So it was definitely kind of an anti-Russian, pro-Western, pro-military capitalism move on behalf of America. And some Americans, particularly in power, were Zionists. They felt strongly that, the Jewish people should have a homeland after the Holocaust, and that they were advocating for it. Certainly much more positive about that than the British were at that time.
Thank you.
Right. Over to you, Pam.
Well, thanks, Michael. I wanted to ask a question, if you would, before I speak, about if you could say something about the settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Right. Very controversial. So There are two. Let's, as we said earlier, there's Area A and Area B. Let's make a distinction between them. First of all, there are groups of kibbutzim and let's call them towns and kibbutzim that have been in that area since 1920s. Ma'ale Adumim is the most famous one. It's a very large town. It's like 10 miles east of Jerusalem, and it's had a Jewish presence there for a very long time, and actually for a period of time living quite peaceably with its neighbors. After 67, there was a very unfortunate American pressure to occupy and settle what is considered Jewish Holy Land, that is Samaria and Judea, because that's where the forefathers had lived and settled. So the tomb of Abraham, the tomb of Sarah is there, the tomb of Joseph. You have Rachel's tomb. This is where the patriarchs and the matriarchs lived and settled. And unfortunately, there was a real push from, and I say America because young Jewish idealists coming out of the 1960s movements felt that they should come to this part of the land and start building settlements, what are now called settlements. They're really gated towns, and they encompass religious Zionists, people who feel very strongly that this is the land that their ancestors inherited and that they own. But it also includes now people who want to buy cheaply and buy land and have a home and land that is much cheaper than buying, say, in Tel Aviv or in Haifa. So these settlements are not uniform anymore, whereas in the 60s and the 70s, they were very much part of what we call religious Zionism. And had they been removed at that time, it would have been an easy thing to do because those people really had no political power in Israel. But now the settlements have increased. They are big towns as well as small villages. They are all gated and fortified, and they include within them people who have been sent there to live. For instance, Russian emigres from the Soviet Union who came into Israel and were given housing, cheap housing in this area, or indeed secular Tel Aviv young people who grew up, could not afford to buy a house in Tel Aviv where their parents lived, and decided to go and live on the West Bank. Again, it's only 40 miles away, so they could drive in to Tel Aviv and have a job and drive back out. And that's pretty much what the settlements have been all about since Netanyahu has been in power, and he's been developing that as a strategic move to ensure that it'll be much more difficult to remove any of those settlements and towns in any future agreement. And I think it's become to the point where that would be impossible. So solutions, the two-state solution, which a lot of people hold dear, would involve dismantling the occupation and dismantling the settlements, and that seems to be a very, very difficult task now.
Thank you. So Rabbi Shire asked me to talk a little bit about my experiences of traveling in Israel and the West Bank. And what I haven't heard yet, Michael, is how much time do I have?
Why don't you take 10 to 15 minutes?
Okay, that's fine.
And then we'll open it up to people.
Okay. I'll take more like 10. I'll say that the first time that I was part of a group that was planning to go to Israel and the West Bank and Gaza was in 1994, I think, 93 or 94. And it was a group that was taking Christian Bibles to Christians who were in Gaza. And part of the project was that we were going to be smuggled into Gaza, riding in ambulances. And I just got too scared. I had 2 little babies at home, and I just thought, this is too much for me. I'm not going to go. So I haven't regretted that, but it's something that I think about, like what an exciting thing that might have been. So my first opportunity to go and not be smuggling myself or anyone else came in the spring of 2007. And I went with a group of Episcopalians led by a priest who was the rector at the church in Winchester, who I had known. He was actually part of this trip in 1994. It was a Christian pilgrimage trip. And so we went to the holy sites that are associated with Christianity. The first thing that I noticed, and this is, I'm going to share my screen. First thing that I noticed was on the drive, when you fly into Tel Aviv, I don't know if any of you have taken this route, but if you go north along Route 6, the separation wall is very close to the highway. And it looks beautiful. It's landscaped, and there's kind of a shallow stone wall. You know, you can tell that there's sand and occasional guard towers, but it doesn't, it looks nice. And it reminded me of the 25 plus years that I've been going into prisons. And I want to show you this picture. I don't know if you've got, let's see. I don't know if any of you have ever been to MCI Framingham, but this is what the women's prison in Massachusetts looks like on the outside. It looks it's got a facade that's kind of like a shopping mall. And you're not allowed to take pictures on the inside, so I can describe it to you. Inside MCI Framingham and underneath the view of the facade is razor wire and concrete wall, and a just dilapidated physical plant. I mean, it's just crumbling, and awful looking on the inside. And it struck me that many people that I know have not been inside of a prison and look at the outside and think, well, you know, that doesn't look so bad. And we just don't, most of us don't see the insides of prisons. Traveling to the West Bank, to Bethlehem, and to other parts of the West Bank, on the other side of the Garden Wall is this, 30-foot long, 30-foot tall, razor wire covered separation wall that is just chilling to be on the inside. But I think most Israeli citizens wouldn't ever see that because they wouldn't have a reason to go, and they wouldn't necessarily know what the security wall looks like on the other side. So that was one thing that I wanted to say I had learned. The second time that I went to Israel, I went by myself. I look back on that as kind of a foolish thing to do. But I wanted to not go with a group. I wanted to kind of do a self-guided tour and take the time that I wanted to take to be in the land. I rented a car. I thought that I had studied Hebrew, and I thought I could read Hebrew, and most of the signs are in Hebrew and English, so I could do this. What I didn't factor in was that the scrolling LED signs are all in Hebrew. And even something as simple as going to a gas station and pumping gas for my rent-a-car, I really couldn't understand anything. I realized that my vocabulary was really biblical Hebrew, and that didn't help at the gas station at all. But somehow I survived. I spent half of my time in the Galilee, right along the sea, and then the other half of my time in East Jerusalem. And I would say that East Jerusalem, in the 6 years between my visit in 2007 and 2013, had really deteriorated. It was just like full of trash, overflowing trash cans. It looked like New York City when the garbage workers go on strike. It was, and as Rabbi was saying, the idea and the hope for a two-state solution was really gone by then. It already didn't seem possible. And so my perspective and the people I stayed with and the people I visited were Christians, Christian Arabs who are Israeli citizens. They they're just kind of getting squeezed by the conflict in the area. They've gone from 100 years ago, Christians made up about 25% of the population, and then as you saw on the charts, the population has increased significantly, and Christians now make up less than 2% of the population west of the Jordan. The Diocese of Jerusalem is an Anglican diocese, so in relationship with the Episcopal Church. And the Diocese of Jerusalem oversees 28 congregations, and those congregations are spread between Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, the occupied territories. So few and far between. There are about 30 institutions that are like hospitals and schools and retirement homes and those kinds of things. They want to position themselves as the voice of moderation and reconciliation between Jews and Muslims. But they're even a smaller subset of the Christians that are there. The evangelical, kind of Western evangelical Christians have kind of aligned themselves with Jewish Zionists because of this really misguided, awful notion that what they want to bring about is the destruction of the world, and that will somehow mean Jesus's second coming. And so Christians are in this really kind of fraught situation, and there's just a lot of despair, both in the West Bank and in Israel, among Christians. So it's sad and hard to go there as an Episcopal priest. The other thing that I'll say is that it's hard for me as a feminist to be in a place that is so deeply patriarchal. I mean, my credentials as a priest don't count when I go to Israel or to the Diocese of Jerusalem. I mean, they know I'm a priest, but it doesn't matter. And that strikes me as not being all that different from Reform rabbis, or in the status of a rabbi when a rabbi is traveling to Israel. It's a humbling experience to be an American citizen and a woman with an education and a position that, like, none of that is particularly helpful when I travel to Israel. I guess the only other thing that I'll tell you, I feel like I have so many stories to share, but I don't want to take up the time. The first time that I went, our group went to the Western Wall, and I was looking at the Western Wall as kind of a, like kind of an archaeological dig. I was curious about the building and I was curious about the people that were praying there, and I thought, well, if I want to kind of get close to see what the people are doing and how the people are praying, then I should write my own prayer, and so I can put it, in a niche in the wall, and I can kind of get close. And so I did that, but it was much more of a kind of academic research kind of approach that I was taking to the Western Wall. But I got up to the wall and I put my prayer in its little place, and I put my hand on the wall and I burst into tears. And I thought, oh, it's the wailing wall. It's not the wail if you want to wall. It's like, this is what happens when you approach this holy place, is that the tears just well up and spill over. And that has really stayed with me for all these years since I first encountered that wall. Is just the prayers of so many people and the tragedy of the place is kind of contained in that Western Wall, I think. So it's been a really emotional exercise for me since Michael asked me if I would say something about my travel there, to think about these things. And I appreciate the invitation. I haven't really talked about these things for a long time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. We kind of want to throw this open to conversation, questions, maybe short accounts of your experiences in the lands amongst the peoples, particularly if you met and had connections with people on the other side of our experience, with those who are not similar. So, Lucy, yeah.
I've been to Israel a lot, and some very nice things have happened for me. I met my husband, who is an archdeacon in the Episcopal Church, and we did go to East Jerusalem. We had to go there very carefully. We couldn't drive our own car to that particular church that Pam spoke about. But I first went to Israel on my own in 1969, which I hear is called like a happy time in Israel. It was sort of, and I felt very safe. I lived on a kibbutz, Kibbutz Mayan Tzvi, which is in the Galilee. I could see the ocean, and I was a mitapelet. I took care of 4 children: Sharoni, Shahar, Gabby, and Hila, and they were 3 years old. And so my 3-year-old Hebrew is really I went back to Israel I came home after about a year and a half. I thought I was just going to stay in Israel, but I was brought back by my sister back to the United States. And 10 years later, I went back to Israel and studied at the university in Jerusalem. And that's where I met Chris. A very, very strong sadness that I had in Israel happened. We took a green olive tour. I think it was in 2016. And Rabbi Berman did remind me before I went. First of all, he told me to have Chris wear his collar. He thought he would be safer doing that. And he also told me that, everything, there was going to be propaganda every single way. And I think that was very true in our experience. And we went to Hebron and Bethlehem, which I had been to with my sister many years earlier. But what really struck me about the West Bank, so I met a lot of children, and the Green Olives tour said, bring toys, bring refreshments, bring stuff. And we gave these things. It was, my husband was like this Pied Piper with all these Palestinian children, and they were all running after him. And it was hot, and it was April when we were there. And my big sadness was that I realized that these kids couldn't get to any water to swim. To get to water, they couldn't. And I'm hearing now that it's like only 40 miles over to the Mediterranean, but they'd have to go all the way down into Jordan, and that just really upset me. It still does.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Hal, yeah.
I lived in Israel. I was there. I was on a company relocation to set up an office. So this was 1979 to 1982. And I traveled all over Israel. I was down in Sharm el-Sheikh, and there was no issues. However, about 3 years ago,
No, more than that.
4 years ago, I took Ying back to Israel, and we drove unescorted through Israel, and it's a different country. It's a different country. You got major highways. You know, when we drove from where we lived outside of Tel Aviv, we'd have to stop the traffic because the goats were crossing the Derech Haifa. You know, but no more. Now we have major highways, so it's almost like a little America. In terms of, I mean, there's a KFC, there's a Walmart. It's not the country that I lived with. You know, I lived in. You know, approximately 30 or 25 years earlier. It's
Right.
changed.
So that's very interesting. Obviously, Israel has developed enormously. It's been called the startup nation, great industrialization, great high tech. The medical industry has grown enormously. And as you say, the infrastructures, the railway, there's a wonderful railway now from the airport to Jerusalem, all of that. What is also interesting is that you can do less now than you could when Hal and Lucy and me were traveling around Israel in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1970s, all of us, we could go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, we could go to Jericho, we could go to Sharm el-Sheikh, as you said. We could go to East Jerusalem. There was a wonderful restaurant in East Jerusalem called Philadelphia. It's my favorite restaurant to go to. It's the best restaurant in Jerusalem. And the most famous hotel in Jerusalem is the Rockefeller Hotel in East Jerusalem. My kids can't go to any of those places anymore. They wouldn't be able to, or it would be dangerous to go there. So we've kind of condensed Israel into this mini America that's Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem and Beersheba, and with kibbutzim and agricultural settlements in between. And it's just not the exotic, exciting Oriental country that I experienced as a teenager. And I think we've lost some of that diversity because of it. On the other hand, you go to the Galilee, it is absolutely beautiful. If you wanted to buy a house in the south of France, or you wanted to buy a house overlooking the Sea of Galilee, I would go for the view over the Sea of Galilee. I mean, there's nothing like it. It's absolutely beautiful countryside. Of course, you have people around you who don't want you to be there, but it is gorgeous, and it's a tragedy that this couldn't have been, the Switzerland of the Middle East, and maybe one day it will be. Any other, Leslie? Yes.
I was there just once in the late 80s with my guy who was Orthodox and, of course, spoke fluent Hebrew and the whole business. And we saw everything. We went every place. We drove every place. We did everything. And the one image that stuck in my head was we were driving. He said we were going to drive down the West Bank from Sfat, I think, or going back toward Jerusalem. And I thought, West Bank, you don't go to the West Bank. I'm going to die. I'm going to be shot. I'm going to be, terrible things are going to happen. My memory of the West Bank is we're driving along and there are a bunch of women soldiers fully in khaki or whatever it is, big guns, and they're all wearing, four of them, white 3-inch high-heeled shoes. And I never, I would have wished I had dared to take a picture, but I couldn't stop laughing for the whole rest of the trip. And I don't understand it. I don't understand it now, but it is my one enduring image.
Yeah, a great image. Great image. I want to end in a minute with a poem, but before we do that, let's just think a little bit about the future. What would the future look like that would be hopeful? As you've heard, the two-state solution was a solution in which that original partition plan would come about, where Palestinians would have their own state in the West Bank area, connected with Gaza, and that the Israeli state would be all around it. That can really only happen if peoples are prepared to live at peace with each other and respect each other's territories, and of course validate each other's existence and their right to the land that they live in. And that could even one day, lead to the opportunities for people, Israelis to live in Israelis to live in Palestine, and of course Palestinians already live in Israel. So that would be a wonderful solution. It'll take a long time, certainly not in our lifetimes, if that was to happen. The latest idea that's come out of Israel and the West Bank particularly is the idea of confederation. This is an idea I've spoke about in a sermon, and it's an idea that it's more regional than national. That is, that local communities who are getting on well together, that is Israeli and Palestinian, Israeli Arab and non-Israeli Arab and Jew, are finding opportunities to confederate. Sometimes they do it for tourism, inviting people to an area that might not necessarily be an area they would choose to go to, but have heard that it's a good place to go and that they will be well looked after. Sometimes it's for trade and commerce. Sometimes it's for land and property. And that where there's a shared common interest and a shared common aim, there seems to be local areas of cooperation and confederation. The problem is that the extremists want to take over, and they want to stop any of these small experimental confederations happening. So people are threatened, things are done to people in the village, or the Israelis themselves, feel that's a threat to any kind of future peace deal, which is a great tragedy. But maybe there'll be more and more people who feel that we really would like to try and do something together. The tragedy of October the 7th was that all the people who lived next door to Gaza in what's called the Sderot region, the area where Hamas attacked, they were all people who wanted that kind of confederation. They had already started working with people in Gaza, took them to hospitals, helped them with their children, employed some of them for cleaning. It was an arrangement that was beginning to work, and Hamas definitely was putting paid to that idea. So we have some hope, but it keeps being dashed, and that's a problem. And this poem by Yehuda Amichai, Israeli poet, may give us a little bit of both amusement and perhaps some sense of a future that is hopeful. Bob, would you read it for us? Before you read it, I need to explain one word. There's a word there, that a phrase, the Chad Gadya machine. Chad Gadya, of course, is a very appropriate. It's the song that we sing at the end of the Passover Seder, and it's the song about the little lamb who is swallowed up by all the other big animals and beasts and other things. So it's a symbolic of the Jew, but any persecuted people who's swallowed up by some kind of machine that's taking over their destiny and not allowing them to become who they want to be.
An Arab shepherd is searching for his goat on Mount Zion, and on the opposite mountain, I am searching for my little boy. An Arab shepherd and a Jewish father, both in their temporary failure. Our voices meet above the Sultan's pool in the valley between us. Neither of us wants the child or the goat to get caught in the wheels of the terrible Hadgadya machine. Afterward, we found them among the bushes, and our voices came back inside us, laughing and crying. Searching for a goat or a son has always been the beginning of a new religion in these mountains.
Thank you for sharing 4,000 years of history of the land and peoples together, and I hope some clarification for the reasons for conflict, but also the possibilities for harmony and coexistence. Thank you to Pam for her contributions, to everybody for participating. Look forward to seeing you either at the second night Seder or indeed at a future event. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Great.
Pam.
Wonderful.
Rabbi.